Dr. Richard Carrier, appreciate you again with all your time. Have another question from a Patreon member. Thank you, T. Rose, for being a patron of ours, and of course, everybody else who supports MythVision. I know this may not be the right question, but I wonder why humans are so prone to believe a myth over the truth. I'm thinking of those people in Paul's day as well as today. How do you think the Jesus movement began if he wasn't a person? Was it started by James or Simon Peter?
Well, the last question part, obviously I think it's Peter, because Paul actually tells us that, right? Peter is the first person to have the revelation, and he has some quorum of 12 that he then convinced to either have or claim to have the same revelation. Revelation at that time could mean either a dream, you dream an encounter with a God and believe that it was real, or a waking vision, and there's a variety of ways that waking visions were normal at the time. We have tons of examples in pagan literature as well. It's not just Christians, right? And Jewish literature too. There's a lot of halakhic literature that talks about ascension stories and revelation stories for rabbis and things like that. And Christianity fits into that model. So it would be Peter, right? Peter would have the first vision. Now, the vision, of course, confirms basically an expectation. The expectation might actually predate Peter, right? We have hints at the Qumran text. The hints of the Qumran text of something like Christianity is already being predicted to occur. Now, the manuscripts are so mutilated and so fragmentary that it's impossible to really nail this down the way we would like to. But it is entirely possible that there was already a sect of Jews who were talking about this going to happen at some point. And then all that Peter adds is, you know what? I had a dream. Jesus came to me and he says, it's done. He did it. And the end has begun. Like it's the clock has started. We got to start missionizing now. So the sort of nascent Christianity could predate him. It's possible. We can't confirm this or refute it because we just don't have the evidence. It doesn't exist, doesn't survive. But Peter definitely is the one who started it. And then when Paul comes along, he modifies it. And he's the one who makes Gentiles able to come in without converting to Judaism. And then that takes over, that just swamps the rest of the church. And so all future Christianity is this Gentile mutation of this Jewish sect. It's not the original sect at all.
So many things to get into. One thing I noticed that you said, and this is what I hope people will vicariously live through MythVision for, you make me back up. Like, as I listen to you, I'll get every other scholar under the sun and go, Richard's wrong in a certain area. And I don't act like you're wrong about everything, but something, right? Mm-hmm. Then I hear you, because I love being a student, and I really want to listen to what you have to say. I don't think I have the answer and you have to.
Right.
And then you start explaining things and I go, man, like we're in this bubble of Christian studies, of New Testament studies, and we're not really thinking of the world, the Mediterranean world where this is at, and all the people that were brushing shoulders and ideas that were going on. So to pin down and be so dogmatic about what the hell we know, we need to pause. But anyway, that was my little revelation just now.
Right. We often don't know things. We have to be comfortable with that. I come from the tradition because I was trained up in Columbia University as a historian, not as a biblical exegete, right?
Right.
I became one through my research and studies and peer-reviewed publications and all of that. But when you come up as a historian, what you're taught is to expect to be disappointed, right? Like part of our mantra is often we just can't answer the question, right? And often you don't know for sure, and you have to admit doubt and uncertainty and things like this. And I find in New Testament studies, there's not as much pushing of that perspective. The actual perspective of actual historians doesn't show up as much in New Testament studies. So if you come from a theology school with a theology PhD or divinity or something like that, you've been given a slightly different epistemology that might make you a lot less comfortable with admitting that you don't know stuff. And so I think maybe that does affect some of the historians who write in this field.
Or especially bucking up against the common understanding of something, especially when we're now admittedly realizing that Judaism is anachronistic, to even use the term this thing we call Judaism, and how much impact Hellenism had within Jewish people's thinking. Like the level. I mean, I'll fill you in later on the Sephirus trip we took and the things we saw, and I'm like, this is a Jewish guy's house, and these are the elite Jewish people in this area, and I'm like, Well, how are they monotheist? Because they can't be when you see what I saw. So anyway, another thing that T. Rose said that I thought was interesting, and it's more of a psychological, there's probably a lot built into this question, but I like
the first part, which is the question of why humans are like this.
Why do people believe, or prone to believe, myth over the truth?
Yeah, so Daniel Dennett did a book, I can't remember the title of it right now. It's eluding me, but it's on this question of basically it's the anthropology and sociology of religion, and he summarizes the sort of state of the scholarship on this. So Daniel Dennett's book on this is the one to start at because it summarizes all of the stuff and then has bibliographies that point you to certain authors like Guthrie's Faces in the Clouds and other authors. There have also been authors who've done like the anthropology and cognitive science of superstition in general. And these, I think, are important studies to look at because they're telling you the answer to this question. And one thing you can do is go to Wikipedia and type in list of cognitive biases. There's a page that's just called List of Cognitive Biases, and it's hundreds of entries long. And it just shows you that's how broken our brains are. Our brains are really badly designed, and they're highly prone to false belief. And it's really hard to fix that. And so really this idea of logic, rationality, scientific method, critical thinking, these are rather late cultural inventions. They're tools, they're kind of like firmware reinstalls that we have to plug in. Our brains don't have this stuff innately. And in fact, our brains don't take it innately either. Like it takes a lot of work even to get it in there. And then of course, you easily will start falling in the ruts of your brain's natural reasoning capabilities, which are pretty poor. So you have to actively struggle to use these tools of reasoning to correct for the flaws and inability of your brain to actually correctly reason. And that takes a lot of effort, but also you have to know that you have to do it, right? So you have to know what the skills are, and then you have to be committed to actually maintaining the use of those skills in all fields. The tendency of people is to fall back into the ruts of our natural brain's construction, and that leads to all kinds of false beliefs.
Yeah. I'm wondering in that question, just getting your thoughts, if myths carry something that truth doesn't typically. There's a false sense of completeness, of wholeness from telling a story. Something psychological there within a narrative, even if it's a lie.
One thing that's good that's happened in the last like 100, 200 years, and Dr. Flynn, who wrote about the Flynn effect, which is the rising IQs that have been happening in the last 100, 150 years, is that we have transitioned from a myth-based culture to a fiction-based culture. So we readily consume fiction and are completely comfortable with the fact that it's fiction, right? So books, comics, movies, television shows, and things like that. So people will use like episodes of Star Trek or the movie Apocalypse Now to speak truths about the world. Like these movies, when they're good and they're well done, they do say true things. And you can use them as allegories or as examples to illustrate certain points that are true in the world. And we do this all the time, but we're comfortable doing it, admitting that, oh yeah, that episode of Star Trek is fiction, but I think like the message of it is still true, right? And that's still empirically defensible, right? That aspect of it. And that's what myth used to do. But what it used to be was that people get really tied up in, if the myth isn't literally true, then neither is the subtext true. And so there's always this tendency to believe the myths are literally true and even get angry at the suggestion that they're not. And now today that's only survived, I think, in political ideologies, where we have mythologies that people need to believe in order to support their political positions. And so they'll have to tell a story. Let me give an example. There was someone once like wrote this angry article about how federal money was being horribly misspent on this freeway island where they planted grass but didn't spend all this money to have people plant grass, but didn't plant any sprinklers and the grass just died. What a waste of money. And you factually research it, and that never happened. It's a myth, right? He just made this story. Well, if he didn't make it up, someone made it up and told it to him, and he just believed it because it agreed with his ideology, and his ideology is supported by it. So it becomes sort of reverse, like the evidence and conclusion is flipped upside down, where you believe this stuff because it supports the things you want to believe, and then it becomes fact.
Right. And
that's the modern myth now. And that's the same way that myth used to work back then, actually. So you have the lower classes, especially the illiterate, used to think the myths were largely true, And if you were to suggest that they weren't, that was actually a threat to their belief system and their identity and things like that. And I actually talk about this in my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire, how even like writers would like advise each other, like, don't talk about how don't talk about how physics explains storms and not gods, right? Like to the poor people, because they're not going to like that. But, just keep that quiet when you're dealing with like poor folk. And so they have things like that where they're really talking to each other, like, don't challenge the myths because people are so ingrained in believing them. And today, that kind of thinking really only survives now in political ideology. It doesn't survive. You could say it survives in religion, but even religion is so caught up now in evidentiary apologetics, right? Like, we need evidence to believe what we're doing. And so you get the fabrication of evidence, you get specious argumentation and things like this, rather than just saying, well, the Bible says, right? Like, you don't run into that as often. Like, it still exists. There's pockets of people who will say, well, the Bible says it, so it must be true. But in general culture, even in America, which is like weirdly more religious than most of the first world, even there, most people don't buy that argument. Say, well, the Bible says, like, yeah, come on, like, what's the evidence of that, right? Yeah. So, that's the way things have changed because of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and also the rise of fiction, because fiction has allowed people to realize, oh, you can just make up stories, right? And so people are, and you analyze and study the stories, so you're much more skeptical and able to analyze and recognize fiction when you see it. So, and myths look a lot like fiction, right? So if you're inclined to see something as fiction, then you're going to be much more skeptical of it. And I think today, like, the idea of religious mythology is kind of in the decline, whereas political mythology is on the rise. And that's where we are, I think. But overall, I think in net, we've kind of transitioned from mythology to fiction as our vehicle for telling second-order truths. Like the idea, like, there's a truth in the story. The story is not literally true, but there is a truth there that makes the story important. And we do that now, but we do it with fiction in a way that in Antiquity they used to do it with myth.